All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we are breaking down a highly charged, incredibly high-stakes debate over a recent Supreme Court ruling on congressional maps. Now, you might be wondering, why does redistricting even matter to your everyday life? Well, it essentially dictates the balance of power in Washington before a single vote is actually cast. We're going to unpack a really fascinating discussion from political commentator Brian Tyler Cohen and election lawyer Mark Elias. They're tackling the super complex intersection of law and, let's be real, bare-knuckle politics, specifically looking at how congressional districts are drawn, challenged, and ultimately implemented. So whether you follow election law super closely or you just want to understand the current intensely competitive political landscape, we are going to map out exactly what's at the very center of this massive legal controversy. We're going to break down the claims from our source material into 5 distinct areas: the Supreme Court ruling itself, the timeline of Alabama's map, the debate over the Purcell Doctrine, the aggressive Democratic countermeasures being proposed, and finally, their calls for structural reform. Okay, let's start with part 1, the Supreme Court ruling. Our source material absolutely does not mince words here. They're calling this a bombshell ruling. And to really grasp this, we have to look at why it's considered such a massive shockwave in the legal community. You see, it is exceptionally rare for the highest court in the land to step in and allow a state to use a congressional map that had just been firmly blocked by a lower federal court. Our sources express some really deep frustration about this. They highlight how tough it is to maintain faith in the judicial system when a map, one that was previously blocked for essentially disregarding prior court orders on voting rights, is suddenly given the green light. The Supreme Court's intervention basically upended everything the lower courts had previously decided, and it threw the upcoming elections in Alabama into completely uncharted territory. Which brings us to part 2, Alabama's map timeline. To understand why the hosts are so fired up, we really need to trace the legal back and forth that actually got us here. Because this dispute didn't just happen overnight, right? It's been this multi-year legal ping-pong match that's caused immense whiplash for basically everyone involved. According to the source, Elias's law firm challenged the original Alabama maps way back in November of 2021. The gears of justice started turning, but by February of 2022, the Supreme Court blocked any changes, basically saying it was simply too close to the primary elections. Fast forward through months of wasted time and confusion to 2023, Alabama draws a new map, which a lower court promptly blocks because, well, it still didn't fix the original issues. And that brings us to the present, where the Supreme Court has abruptly stepped back in to say Alabama actually can use that contested 2023 map after all. It's an exhausting saga of starts, stops, and total reversals. Now, the hosts emphasize a very specific and, quite honestly, crucial detail about that 2023 lower court rejection. The 3 lower court judges who blocked that 2023 map, they were not liberal activists. They were actually conservative Trump-appointed judges, and they had explicitly deemed the map non-compliant with the law and the Constitution because it failed to remedy the original voting rights violations. Why does this matter so much? Because it totally shatters the expectation that this is just your standard partisan disagreement. When even conservative judges look at a map and say, hey, this is legally non-compliant, it severely elevates the gravity of the Supreme Court's decision to just override them and let them out proceed anyway. Moving on to part 3, the Purcell Doctrine debate. This is the specific legal doctrine right at the heart of the hosts' argument about judicial hypocrisy. According to the explainer sources, the Supreme Court relied heavily on this specific doctrine back in 2022, and this is where their core grievance lies. So what is it? The Purcell Doctrine is basically the legal principle that courts shouldn't change election rules or maps too close to an election, just to avoid confusing voters. Think of it like a sports referee deciding not to suddenly change the fundamental rules of a football game right as the 4th quarter begins. Makes sense, right? Well, the state of Alabama leaned heavily on this argument in 2022, insisting it was logistically just too late to change the maps. And the Supreme Court agreed, citing this exact doctrine to pause any changes. But here's the kicker. The hosts forcefully argue that the court applied this doctrine with glaring inconsistency. Take 2022, for example. 4.5 months away from an election was considered dangerously close, meaning voters had to use a map the court had already flagged as problematic. Yet today, the hosts point out that the Supreme Court is now allowing a newly contested, previously rejected map to be implemented despite the fact that hundreds of thousands of voters have already begun casting their ballots in places like Louisiana and Alabama. We're not talking 4 months away anymore. Voting is actively underway. The rule that completely prevented changes before seems to have just vanished the second the context shifted. Elias's main assertion here is that the Supreme Court's rulings are shifting based entirely on political convenience, rather than any sort of strict legal consistency. He argues that when minority voters' rights are on the line, they're basically told to wait because of the Purcell Doctrine. But, to use his exact words, when the shoe is on the other foot and conservative states want to implement their preferred maps, the doctrine is seemingly ignored, and whatever the states want to do is suddenly fine. Because of this perceived hypocrisy, the hosts are completely shifting gears. They aren't calling for a traditional legal defense anymore. They are straight up calling for political warfare. Which perfectly cues up Part 4, the proposed Democratic countermeasures. Let's look at the aggressive political counteroffensive our hosts are laying out. The source material uses incredibly visceral language here. Elias argues that Democrats in blue states like California and New York have got to maximize their seat counts with a ferocity they just haven't shown yet. He flatly states that playing by the old norms while the opposition allegedly weaponizes every single law to gain power is a total losing battle. He isn't holding back at all. When people tell him not to bring a knife to a gunfight, he says he doesn't even want to bring a gun. He wants to bring missiles and hand grenades. This is a totally unapologetic abandonment of that old, when they go low, we go high political philosophy. He wants his side to fight significantly harder and far more ruthlessly. The crucial strategy here relies heavily on the concept of mutually assured destruction. Elias argues that if Republicans push boundaries to take, say, 5 seats in red states, Democrats can't just go find 4 or 5 seats of their own and call it a wash. No, they need to put 30 seats on the table. It isn't just simple math. It is a deterrent strategy. The goal is to make the political cost so punishingly high that if the opposition escalates this map-drawing battle, they understand they are going to wind up on the severe losing side of the numbers game. They want to create an absolute, undeniable threat. What's really fascinating here is that the source's anger isn't just directed across the aisle or at the Supreme Court. It's directed squarely at their own party's leadership. The hosts specifically call out leaders like Colorado's Democratic Governor, Jared Polis. They argue that in the face of these super aggressive tactics from red states, leaders in blue states who do absolutely nothing to maximize their own seat counts simply aren't up for the job. They are furious at blue state leaders who are still trying to play fair in what they view as a fundamentally broken system. They're demanding that Democratic-controlled states go pedal to the metal and spare absolutely zero opposition incumbents. And finally, Part 5, calls for structural reform. So what is the ultimate endgame to all of this escalation? The host's core philosophy here is basically weaponized gerrymandering in the pursuit of ending gerrymandering. It's an incredibly high-stakes game of political chicken. Step 1, blue states aggressively gerrymander to threaten Republican incumbents. Step 2, those Republican incumbents feel the heat, realize they're about to lose their own seats, and they panic. This panic then forces their party leadership to finally agree to national anti-gerrymandering laws. Elias emphasizes that he deeply wants reform, absolutely, but only on equal terms, never through unilateral surrender. They truly believe creating intense political chaos is the only way to eventually force order. Now, to fuel this aggressive strategy, the hosts are heavily pushing specific platforms and playbooks. They argue that enacting national anti-gerrymandering legislation and implementing major structural Supreme Court reform are the ultimate goals, but they need tools to get there. They frame resources like Elias's election news outlet Democracy Docket and Cohen's new book, The Day After, not just as reading material, but as tactical playbooks. These resources outline bolder, much more aggressive strategies for when their party assumes power. They are actively trying to build an infrastructure for this new era of political warfare. The hosts of our source material firmly believe that fighting fire with massive, overwhelming fire is literally the only way back to a fair democracy. But we want to leave you with this to consider. What is the long-term impact of this kind of mutually assured political destruction? If the only way to save a fair system is to engage in ruthless, scorched earth political tactics, well, what kind of democracy are you actually left with when the dust finally settles? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. It's an incredibly complex debate, but understanding the strategy driving these decisions is absolutely crucial for making sense of our current political reality.